This is Sam Gustin with Time. Very pleased to have Ian Bremmer, the president of the Eurasia Group and the author of Every Nation for Itself, Winners and Losers in a G0 World. Ian, thanks for joining us.
Sam, very pleased.
In a nutshell, what's the point of your book?
Well, we've lived for decades in a world of U.S.-led leadership. Coming out of World War II, whether you want to talk about the United Nations, the Security Council, or the IMF, and the World Bank, the Bretton Woods Accord on currency, you name it, globalization was driven by the United States, its allies, its priorities, its values, its capital. That is not true anymore. We will not have U.S.-led global institutions or leadership. Whether or not you think the U.S. is in decline, the United States is not going to bail out Europe. Whether or not you think we're in decline, we're not going to remove Assad from power in Syria or lead a global trade deal or global climate deal. And you know what? No one else is either. And that's what I call a G0 world, not a G7, not a G8, not a G20. G20 is aspirational, but what we have is a G0. And this book talks about what it means to suddenly find ourselves living in a world without global leadership, what the implications of that are for policymakers and for investors and for Americans.
In your book, you argue that China has other things to worry about than exerting leadership on the international stage. Why is that?
Yeah, China is not about to enter its century. The Chinese will become the world's largest economy in all likelihood, maybe in 10 years, maybe in 20. But it will happen. When that happens, they will be a poor country. They will still be a poor country. I mean, when you are a developing country, and you're an authoritarian state that must control the flow of information to ensure you stay in power, you do everything possible to maintain your own stability. The United States has 15% real unemployment right now, 15%, and yet we're still focused on the environment and climate, much more than an emerging market would be. Why? Because we are rich enough to have the luxury to do that. We can talk about contraception in this country. We can talk about religious rights. In China, they're not talking about that. They're talking about jobs. They're talking about growth, right? And I think we underappreciate just how changed the world will be when the largest economy is poor.
In the book, you say that in the new G0 world, cheaters will prosper. Can you give me an example of how that might happen?
Well, I can give you a few. I mean, on the one hand, look, the G0 world is all about, do you have standards, right? Do you have common standards? Are you able to uphold them? Can you sanction effectively when people misbehave? Who are your referees, right? And that could be something like a country like Iran that gets away with more than it would otherwise, or Burma, who people now want to do business with, if just they reform just a little bit, right? But it's also people like drug traffickers and human traffickers, because it's harder to actually crack down on these people effectively. There are more lawless areas that they can operate. But it's also legitimate cheating. It's people that are able, and companies that are able to take advantage of the fact that they arbitrage against all of these different types of rules and norms. You look at Apple Corporation, most profitable multinational corporation in the West today, and look at what they pay in taxes. From Apple's perspective, the G0 world is a great place to be because they don't have a single set of taxes that they're going to have to play by that rule. They are big enough and flexible enough that they can really work that system. Companies that can do that will thrive in a G0 world.
How do we establish trade agreements and continue to do free trade without some sort of international system of norms that ensures that global multinationals like Apple have a level or a common system throughout the world?
Well, Sam, this is a really big problem because I believe that the age of U.S.-led global institutions is over. And going forward, you will either have global institutions that aren't U.S.-led, or you'll have U.S.-led institutions that aren't global. Now, what does that mean for trade? It means Doha is dead. You are not going to move anymore on global trade. And yet, if you're an American multinational, you want global trade because that's the biggest possible market. Now, what the United States is doing is interesting. They're responding by saying, let's do the Trans-Pacific Partnership as our new big trade architecture deal, the TPP. And it says that the U.S. and like-minded countries, Mexico, Canada, Japan, world's third largest economy, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, we're going to get them together and we're going to form a deeper trade agreement. And we're not going to include China because we know China won't play by these rules. Now, that is a less efficient model than the old model.
In other words, we're moving from a global trade structure
Absolutely.
to a more regional trade agreement structure, right?
And I would argue that that reflects reality. I would argue that the TPP is, frankly, if we can make it work, and there's a big if there, but if we can make it work, actually really responds in the best of all worlds given the constraints that the G0 puts upon us.
Ian, thank you very much for joining us today.
Very happy to be with you, Sam.